There's a type of politeness that feels right on the surface, but leaves you strangely unsettled after. Nothing obvious is wrong. The words are correct, the tone is smooth, the timing is perfect, and yet something doesn't land. You've felt this before. Someone smiles, asks about you, even listens carefully. But when it's over, you don't feel understood. You feel processed. Most people ignore that feeling. They tell themselves they're overthinking, that they shouldn't judge too quickly. But that reaction is exactly what allows it to work. Because genuine warmth doesn't feel calculated. It doesn't feel like it's following a script. Forced politeness does. It's not driven by connection. It's driven by intention, maintaining an image, avoiding discomfort, controlling how they're perceived. And if you pay attention, you'll notice something unsettling. The words stay consistent, but the energy behind them never quite matches. It's like talking to someone who knows exactly what to say, but has no real reason to say it. And the more you ignore that mismatch, the easier it becomes for people like this to stay in your life. Not because they're genuine, but because they're just convincing enough to make you question your own instincts. Some people don't have one personality. They have several, depending on who's in the room. You'll notice it in small moments. The way they talk to you feels natural, but the second someone else walks in, something shifts. Their tone adjusts, their opinions soften or change. Even their mannerisms start to mirror the person they're trying to impress. And it's subtle enough that you can't really call it out, but it happens just enough that you start to question it. Because now you're left with a quiet, uncomfortable thought. Which version of them is real? Genuine people might adapt slightly to different situations, but there's a consistency underneath it. You recognize who they are, no matter who they're with. But with someone like this, that consistency starts to disappear. You're not interacting with a person anymore. You're interacting with whichever version fits the moment. And over time, that creates a kind of instability you can't fully explain. You start wondering what they actually believe, what they really think, and whether anything they've said to you stays true when you're not around. Because the problem isn't just that they change, it's that you can't predict how or why they change. And that uncertainty slowly erodes trust, even if nothing openly goes wrong. Most of the time, they're not trying to deceive you directly. They're trying to fit in everywhere. But in doing that, they lose something essential, a fixed sense of who they are. And when someone doesn't have that, no matter how comfortable they seem in the moment, there's always a quiet part of you that stays on guard, because you're never quite sure who you're really dealing with. Not all compliments are meant to make you feel good. Some are designed to sound like praise, while quietly putting you in your place. You'll notice it in the way they're delivered. You did better than I expected. I didn't think you had that in you. On the surface, it sounds positive, but something about it lingers, not as confidence, but as doubt. Because instead of lifting you, it subtly reminds you of where they think you stand. And the uncomfortable part is, you can't easily call it out. If you question it, it makes you look overly sensitive, like you're reacting to something harmless. So you let it go. But over time, those small moments start to add up. Their words don't just compliment you, they define you. They create a quiet comparison, a subtle hierarchy where they remain just slightly above you, without ever saying it directly. And without realizing it, you start adjusting. You become more careful, more aware of how you come across, maybe even a little unsure of yourself around them then. Because genuine appreciation feels clear. It doesn't make you second guess what was meant. But these kinds of compliments aren't really about connection. They're about control, shaping how you see yourself while protecting how they're seen. And the reason it works so well is because it sounds just close enough to sincerity that you keep accepting it, even when it never quite feels right. Some people feel present in your life, right up until you actually need them. When things are easy, they're there. Conversations flow, they respond, they seem engaged enough that you don't question it. But the moment something shifts, when you need support, clarity, or even just someone to stand beside you, their presence starts to fade. Replies get slower, their energy changes. They become just distant enough that you can't fully call it out, but close enough that you notice. At first, you explain it away. They're busy, they have their own problems, but then a pattern starts to form. You remember how available they were when things were light, and how that consistency disappears the moment it requires something real. And that contrast is hard to ignore once you see it, because genuine people don't just show up when it's convenient. They show up imperfectly, inconsistently even, but they show up when it matters. But with someone like this, their presence is conditional. It depends on comfort, on benefit, on how easy it is for them to be there. And when those things disappear, so do they. What makes it unsettling is that there's no clear betrayal, no argument, no obvious breaking point, just a quiet absence that slowly forces you to realize something you didn't want to admit. They were never really there in the moments that mattered, only in the moments that were easy. Some people don't really have conversations with you. They just wait for their turn to bring it back to themselves. You'll notice it if you pay attention. You start talking about your day, and within moments, it becomes a story about theirs. You share something personal, and it shifts into how they experienced something similar. And it's done so smoothly that it almost feels like connection, like they're relating to you, but they're not really staying with what you said. They're redirecting it. And over time, that creates a quiet imbalance. You're sharing, but not being held in the conversation. You're speaking, but not actually being heard. And the strange part is, you don't always catch it in the moment. You just leave feeling slightly unheard, without knowing exactly why. Because genuine interest has a kind of stillness to it. It lets your experience exist without needing to compete with it. But when someone constantly shifts the focus back to themselves, it usually reflects something deeper. Not just habit, but a need for attention, a discomfort with not being at the center, an inability to fully sit inside someone else's perspective without pulling it back into their own. And once you start noticing that pattern, the dynamic becomes hard to ignore. The conversation might include you, but it was never really about you. And that's why you can spend so much time talking to someone like this and still walk away feeling like you were never truly heard. Some people turn every interaction into a competition without ever saying it out loud. You'll notice it in small moments. You share an achievement, and they respond with something just a little bigger. You open up about a struggle, and it somehow becomes about how they had it worse. And it's subtle enough that you can't really call it out. It doesn't feel aggressive, it feels polite. But over time, something starts to shift. Instead of feeling supported, you feel measured. Instead of feeling understood, you feel evaluated. And without realizing it, you start holding back. Not because you want to, but because sharing around them doesn't feel the same anymore. Because genuine people don't experience your life as something to compete with. They can sit with your wins without needing to match them. They can hear your struggles without turning them into comparisons. But someone like this can't do that. They don't just listen to what you say, they compare it, they measure it, and somewhere underneath it all, they need to feel like they're not behind you. And that changes the entire dynamic, because now the connection isn't mutual anymore, it's conditional. Every moment becomes something to balance, something to respond to, something to stay ahead of. And once you see that, you realize you were never just sharing your life with them. You were being quietly compared to theirs. At some point, this stops being about them and starts being about you. Because if you think back, you've felt this before, not as a clear thought, but as a pause, a hesitation you couldn't explain, a moment where something didn't fully sit right, even when everything looked fine on the surface, and almost every time you ignored it. Not because you weren't aware, but because you chose to be reasonable. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You told yourself you were overthinking. You looked for explanations that made their behavior easier to accept. And slowly, those small inconsistencies stopped standing out. They blended in. Because your mind is very good at protecting connections, even when those connections aren't as real as they seem. It prefers comfort over confrontation. But your intuition doesn't work like that. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself. It just notices patterns and waits. And when those patterns repeat, the forced politeness, the shifting personality, the confusing compliments, the absence when it mattered,
the conversations that circle back, the quiet competition, it reaches a conclusion. Not loudly, not urgently, just consistently. And the question isn't whether those signals were there, it's how many times you felt them and chose not to listen. Because once you stop ignoring that quiet recognition, even just a little, you begin to see people differently, not through what they say, but through what stays consistent beneath it. And that shift doesn't make you cynical, it makes you harder to mislead.
The most convincing people don't feel fake at all, at least not in the beginning. In fact, they're usually the ones who feel the easiest to trust, comfortable, familiar, natural to be around. And that's exactly what makes the realization so unsettling later, because nothing about the connection felt wrong. It felt right. But over time, something starts to shift, not all at once, but in small moments that only make sense when you look back. And that's when you begin to see it differently. The comfort wasn't always consistency, it was adaptability. The ease wasn't always depth, it was skill. And the trust you felt wasn't always built on truly understanding you, but on knowing how to be received by you. And that changes everything. Because now the question isn't just about who they were, it's about how easily a connection can feel real without actually being grounded in something stable. We're wired to respond to familiarity, to trust warmth, to assume intention where things feel good. And that's exactly why this is so hard to see in the moment. Not because you weren't aware, but because everything felt close enough to real that questioning it never felt necessary. But with distance comes clarity. And you start to realize that not every connection you felt deeply was built on the same kind of intention. And that doesn't erase what you experienced, but it does change how you understand it. Because in the end, this was never just about spotting fake people. It was about realizing how something can feel completely genuine right up until the moment you finally see it clearly. If this video felt a little too accurate, like it was putting words to things you've noticed but never fully explained, there's probably a reason for that. Because most of what we talked about isn't obvious. It's subtle, gradual, easy to overlook while it's happening. And recognizing it isn't about labeling people or becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's about paying attention to what you already feel without immediately dismissing it. Because people aren't simply real or fake. They're layered, complex, sometimes consistent, sometimes performative. And learning to see that difference doesn't make you cynical. It just makes you more aware of what connection actually feels like, when it's genuine and when it isn't. So instead of carrying this as doubt toward others, carry it as clarity for yourself. The kind that helps you notice what feels steady, what feels mutual, and what quietly doesn't. And if this perspective stayed with you, if it made you look at certain moments a little differently, then you'll probably find the next videos just as interesting. Because this isn't really about judging people, it's about understanding the patterns behind how people think, act, and how we experience them.